I am Demi Cook, 36 years old. 2 weeks ago, after exactly 9 years of absolute silence, my mother stood on my front porch. In her hand was a piece of paper folded in four. No hug. No questions about her grandchildren. It was an invoice, handwritten, blue ink, every line item detailed. The total, $925,000. The only thing she said was, "It's time we talk about the family's future." But my mother forgot that I am an Army officer. I have a list of my own. For 9 years, every card stamped "returned to sender," every ignored voicemail, every snide text my sister sent behind my back. It's all labeled, dated, and tucked away in a blue plastic folder sitting in the bottom drawer of my desk. She brought a demand. I brought a sentence. Before we get into it, if you're new here, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps a lot. And hey, drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love reading those. Let me take you back to the summer I turned 27. The summer my own blood decided I was no longer one of them. It started with a taco truck and the smell of burnt lard. Midnight in Portland. The sidewalk was stained with old oil leaks and dried rain, glowing under the sickly orange hum of the streetlights. Marcus didn't have a script. He didn't have a tuxedo. He just had those hands, rough, calloused, grease-stained hands that smelled like a mix of diesel fuel and cheap peppermint soap. He dropped to one knee right there next to a pile of overflowing trash bags. He held out a plain silver band. Not a diamond, not a status symbol, just a promise. I am not ever letting go of you, Demi. I felt the sting in my eyes before I felt the smile. I took a slow sip of my horchata, the thick cinnamon sweetness coating my tongue, and I nodded. For the first time in 27 years, the noise in my head stopped. I wasn't a soldier, a daughter, or a paycheck. I was just home. The next morning, the reality of Ohio came back to claim its debt. I was sitting in my Jeep, parked outside the base headquarters. The interior was an oven, the air thick with the smell of hot upholstery and stale coffee. I stared at the dashboard clock. 800. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, then I dialed the house in Millfield. My heart was a hammer hitting an anvil. "Mom, I'm getting married." Nothing. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. On the other end of the line, I could hear the faint, tinny warble of the Weather Channel on the TV. Diane always kept it on. Low volume, constant. A background hum of predictable disasters in a town where nothing ever really changed. 4, 5, 6, 7. Think very carefully about how this affects the reputation of this family, Demi, Diane said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was cold. It was the sound of a blade sliding across ice. You are making a choice that cannot be undone. Click. The dial tone was a flat line. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask the date. She didn't ask if I was happy. She just hung up and left me there in the heat, the sweat dripping down my spine, staining my ACS. I looked at the phone screen. A 32-second call that had just burned a bridge I'd spent my whole life trying to build. 2 weeks later, the hammer dropped for good. Mail call at the barracks is usually a loud, chaotic affair, but when I saw that envelope in my cubby, the room seemed to go silent. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, expensive paper that Diane only used when she wanted to remind someone she was better than them. It looked out of place against the olive drab paint and the gray concrete floor. I took it back to my bunk and sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned under my weight. I tore the top of the envelope. No, dear Demi. No, love, Mom. Just 3 lines written in her sharp, blue-inked cursive. It was a tactical strike on high-end stationery. If you walk down that aisle with him, do not expect to walk back through this front door. He's not the right class. He's not one of us. I read those words until they blurred. Not one of us. I thought about Marcus's calloused hands. I thought about the way he looked at me at that taco truck. Then I thought about the years I'd spent scrubbing toilet floors, getting straight A's, and shipping off to war just so Diane could brag to her bridge club about her officer daughter. I was good enough to fund their lifestyle, but I wasn't good enough to choose my own. Any other girl my age would have crumbled. They would have called back, begging for a compromise, crying into their pillows. But I wasn't a civilian anymore. The Army had spent years breaking me down and rebuilding me with a spine of reinforced steel. They taught us that when the enemy opens fire, you don't panic. You don't weep. You seek cover, you assess the damage, and you start collecting the shrapnel. You don't ignore the attack, you document it. I stood up and smoothed out the wrinkles in my bedsheet. I walked over to my wall locker and pulled out a fresh, blue plastic folder. It was clean, empty. A blank slate for a new kind of war. I sat back down at my small desk and pulled a red Sharpie from my drawer. My hand didn't shake. I felt a strange, cold clarity settling over me, the kind of stillness you feel right before a jump. I placed the cream-colored letter inside the first plastic sleeve. The paper felt thick and arrogant between my fingers. I took the red marker and wrote 2 words on the top left corner. Item 01. I slid the sleeve into the folder and heard the plastic crinkle. It was a sharp, dry sound, like a dead leaf being crushed under a boot. I closed the folder. The blue cover felt cool against my palms. I stared at it for a long minute, listening to the muffled sounds of boots hitting the hallway floor outside. Diane thought she was ending a conversation. She thought she was putting me in my place. She had no idea she had just handed me the first piece of evidence in her own trial. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and tucked the folder away. I pushed the drawer shut until I heard the click. I wasn't hurt anymore. I was an officer on a mission, and I had just started the clock. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the gray concrete wall. I wondered if she'd always been this way. I wondered if the greed and the ice had been there since the beginning, hidden under the Sunday dresses and the bake sales. I needed to know. I needed to look back at the books, at the ledgers of my childhood, to see exactly when my mother decided that her daughter wasn't a human being, but a depreciating asset. The cream-colored letter shouldn't have shocked me. Not really. In the cookhouse, love was never a feeling. It was an audit. It was a line item on a balance sheet that never quite added up in my favor. Growing up in Millfield, Ohio, meant living in a town where the rust from the old steel mills didn't just eat the cars, it ate the people too. Everything was measured in what it cost and who was paying for it. My mother, Diane, didn't have a heart. She had a spiral-bound notebook with a frayed cover and a tight-fisted grip on every cent that moved through that kitchen. She sat at the Formica table every Sunday night, the fluorescent light over the stove flickering like a dying nerve. I can still hear the scratch of her pen against the paper. It was the sound of judgment. Paige, my younger sister, was the family's star investment. Paige needed braces. Paige needed a $600 dress for the spring formal because she was sensitive and deserved to feel beautiful. Diane's pen would fly across the page, approving the funds without a second thought. Then there was me. I was the overhead. I was the maintenance cost Diane hated paying. I wore Paige's old sweaters, the wool pilled and scratching at my neck. I spent my Saturdays scrubbing the grout in the bathroom until my fingernails bled, all while Paige napped on the sofa. If I brought home an A+ in calculus, Diane didn't look up from her ledger. She'd just tap her pen and give a dismissive shrug. "That's what you're supposed to do so you aren't a drain on this house," she'd say. I wasn't a daughter to her. I was a depreciating asset. Paige was the future. I was just a mouth to feed. My father, Kenneth, was a ghost who smelled like pine shavings and cheap cigarettes. He spent 12 hours a day at the wood shop 2 miles down the road, coming home with sawdust caked in the creases of his forehead. He was a man of wood and silence. He talked to his lathes more than he ever talked to me. I remember the day Paige failed her math final and cried for 3 hours. Kenneth didn't scold her. He went to the kitchen jar, emptied his secret stash of overtime pay, and bought her a used Honda Civic. "The girl can't handle walking to the bus stop in this cold," he muttered, his eyes glued to the floor. 2 weeks later, I walked into his shop. The air was thick with the smell of oak and old oil. I held my acceptance letter to the university in my shaking hand. I didn't ask for a car. I just needed help with the deposit. Kenneth didn't even stop turning the wrench in his hand. He gripped that cold steel so tight his knuckles turned white. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. "Your mother says there's no money left, Demi," he grunted. "You're smart. You'll figure it out on your own." The silence in that shop was louder than any shout. It was the sound of a father choosing the easy path over his own child. That was the moment I realized the bridge wasn't just broken, it had never been built. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I walked out of that shop, the cold Ohio wind cutting through my thin jacket, and I made a call. I signed my life over to the government. At 18, I joined the ROTC. I sold my sweat, my youth, and eventually my blood to the Army because the U.S. government was more willing to invest in my future than the people who shared my DNA. I traded a bedroom in Millfield for a bunk in a barracks, and I never looked back. The day I left, there was no big send-off. No, "Good luck, honey." The kitchen stove was stone cold. Diane was in the living room, her eyes glued to some trashy reality TV show, the blue light of the screen washing out her face. She didn't even turn around when I lugged my green duffel bag toward the front door. The bag was heavy, the canvas rough against my palm, containing everything I owned in the world. If you're listening to this and you've ever been the black sheep, or if you've spent your life being treated like a bill instead of a person, hit that like button right now. It lets me know I'm not the only one who had to build a fortress out of their own scars. And do me a favor, drop the word survivor in the comments. I want to see how many of us made it out of those houses and built something for ourselves. It really helps the channel reach others who are still stuck in the silence. Subscribe so you don't miss how I turn these receipts into a weapon. As I reached for the front door, I felt something in the side pocket of my bag. I reached in and pulled out a scrap of yellowed paper, torn in a hurry. I recognized the blue ink, Diane's handwriting. "Come home soon. You belong here." For a split second, my throat tightened. I wanted to believe it was love. I wanted to believe she'd miss me. But then I looked back at the empty kitchen, at the ledger sitting on the table, and I knew the truth. She didn't want me back because she loved me. She wanted me back because she was losing her free labor. She was losing the one person who kept the house running while she sat in the blue light. I tucked that scrap of paper into my wallet. I didn't keep it as a memento of affection. I kept it as a warning. It stayed there for 9 years, a jagged little piece of evidence, a reminder that some people will call you family only when they need someone to bleed for them. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the morning air. I walked toward the bus station, my back straight, my eyes on the horizon. I was done being a line item. I was ready to become a soldier. But as I sat on that bus, watching the gray hills of Ohio fade away, I realized I'd left one thing behind, something I hadn't noticed until the bus crossed the state line: the folder. The blue plastic folder wasn't just for my military papers. I had started a new ledger that morning. And the first entry wasn't about money. It was about the cost of a father's silence at a train station that I never expected to see again. June in Portland usually brings a soft, gray drizzle that clings to the skin like a damp wool blanket. But that morning, the sun was a white-hot blade cutting through the smog. The Multnomah County Courthouse smelled like industrial floor wax, old coffee, and the weary sweat of people waiting for divorces or traffic court. I stood in the middle of the lobby, my back locked in a parade rest straightness that felt more like a cage than a posture. I wasn't wearing white silk or designer lace. I was wearing a thrift store find I'd snagged for $160. It was a cream-colored lace number, probably a decade old, with a hem that dragged slightly on the grit-covered tile. It smelled faintly of cedar and someone else's memories. In my hands, I gripped a bouquet of 6 roses I'd grabbed from a Shell station on the way there. $6 for 6 flowers. The plastic wrap crinkled in the silence of the hall, a sharp, annoying sound that mocked the gravity of the moment. Marcus stood next to me, looking uncomfortable in a stiff charcoal suit that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders. He looked like a man trying to be something the world told him he wasn't. But when he caught my eye, the suit didn't matter. Behind us stood my only family, 12 soldiers from my unit, standing in their dress blues like a line of blue steel fence posts. They were the only ones who had shown up. Across the rotunda, another wedding party was erupting in laughter. A blonde bride was being engulfed in the silk-clad arms of a dozen relatives. Her father, a man in an expensive tan suit, was weeping openly while clutching her hand. I looked away. My side of the aisle was a desert. A vacant, echoing stretch of marble that reminded me exactly where I stood in the cook hierarchy. I was the ghost at my own wedding. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a sick, flickering buzz. Just as the bailiff called our names, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I flinched. My body was wired to expect a blow or a cold remark, but what I got was the scent of lavender soap. The real kind, made from oil and lye, not some drugstore spray. I turned to see Cora, Marcus's mom. She was wearing a floral dress she'd clearly ironed until the seams were sharp enough to draw blood. Her hair was pulled back tight, her face a map of hard years and honest work. She didn't say some poetic junk about love, she just looked at my back. "The lace is snagged on the button, honey," she whispered. Her voice was low, like the sound of a steady engine. I felt her fingers move against the small of my back. They were rough, calloused from years of nursing and scrubbing, but they moved with a precision I hadn't felt since my last rifle drill. She worked that tiny button through the loop with a calm, steady hand. Once she finished, she didn't step away. She wrapped her arms around me, pulling me into a hug that smelled like home and laundry detergent. She leaned in and kissed the top of my head. "Welcome home, my daughter," she said. It was 5 words that hit me harder than any drill sergeant's scream. My throat closed up. The iron wall I'd built in my chest, the one that had survived basic training and Ohio winters, just crumbled into the dirt. I didn't sob. I didn't have the luxury of a breakdown. I just let out one shaky breath while 2 hot, heavy tears tracked through the cheap makeup on my cheeks. I wasn't an officer. I wasn't a line item. For a 30-second window in a government building, I was just a girl who belonged. The ceremony lasted 10 minutes. The judge didn't look up from his desk. The "I do" felt like a contract signature, cold and binding. By the time we walked out into the humid afternoon air, Marcus was officially mine, and I was officially an outcast. That night, we didn't have a reception. We stayed in a motel near the base with a stained orange carpet and an air conditioner that sounded like it was chewing on gravel. Marcus was asleep, his breathing a steady rhythm that usually kept me grounded. But I couldn't sleep. I sat at the small laminate desk under the yellow glare of a bedside lamp. I stared at a Polaroid one of my guys had taken. It was Marcus wiping a tear off my face in the courthouse lobby. He looked at me with a terrifying kind of devotion. I pulled out a white envelope. My hands were as steady as they were on the firing range. I tucked the photo inside. No note, no explanation. I addressed it to the house in Millfield. It was my last olive branch. A final bridge made of paper and hope. I walked to the blue mailbox on the corner, the asphalt still radiating the day's heat, and let the metal flap clang shut. The sound was final. A period at the end of a long, jagged paragraph. 11 days later, I stood at the mail cluster in our apartment complex. The air smelled of mown grass and car exhaust. I saw the envelope. It was my handwriting, my stamp. But someone had slammed a rubber stamp across the center with enough force to dent the paper. The ink was a screaming, violent red. Refused. Returned to sender. They hadn't even opened it. Diane hadn't even looked at the photo. She'd seen the return address and decided I didn't exist. I didn't cry this time. The heat in my chest just turned to ice. I walked upstairs, my boots heavy on the wooden steps. I pulled the blue plastic folder from the bottom drawer. I didn't throw the envelope away. I smoothed it out and slid it into the second sleeve. I took my red Sharpie and wrote Item 02. In December, when my Christmas card came back with the same red ink, I labeled it Item 03. The dossier was growing. The evidence was piling up. Diane thought she was winning a war of silence. She had no idea she was just handing me the ammunition I'd need when I finally decided to fire back. I stared at the red ink until it burned into my retinas. The Cook family was officially a hostile entity. and I was just getting started on the battle plan. Year 2. Portland winters do not just get cold, they get damp. It is a wet chill that finds the marrow of your bones and settles there like a debt you can't pay off. Our garage smelled like old cardboard, leaking motor oil, and the sour, milky scent of baby spit-up. Marcus's face was washed out by the blue glare of 3 battered ThinkPads he'd salvaged from a tech graveyard. The cooling fans rattled like they were breathing their last, a rhythmic hum that filled the cramped space while the rest of the neighborhood slept. We were bootstrapping, the fancy word the tech blogs used for being flat-out broke and desperate. By day, I was in my ACS, a captain now, calculating logistics for a battalion. I moved men and machines across maps with the kind of precision that left no room for error. But by 1900, the uniform came off. I became a CFO in a sweatshirt, huddled over a spreadsheet by the light of a 40-watt bulb, while my twins, Liam and Ava, screamed in their playpen. My eyes felt like someone had rubbed them with coarse salt. Dinner was usually a can of generic bean soup hotted up in the microwave and eaten standing over the sink. We didn't have a seed round. We didn't have a trust fund. All we had was Marcus's brain and my ability to squeeze a nickel until the buffalo screamed. We weren't entirely alone, though. Cora had moved in. She'd given up her small apartment, packed her life into 3 suitcases, and claimed the cramped love seat in our living room. She was the only reason I didn't lose my mind. I'd come home from base, my brain fried from military red tape, and find Cora with Liam on one hip and a bottle in the other. She'd sleep in 2-hour bursts, her knees tucked to her chest on that tiny sofa, just so I could get enough shut-eye to keep from crashing my Jeep on the way to the morning briefing. She was our secret weapon, our soldier in the trenches of sleep deprivation. I still tried, back then. I was a fool, I guess. I sent the ultrasound photos to Millfield. I sent the birth announcements with the tiny footprints stamped in blue and pink ink. I sent a Christmas card with a picture of the twins in their little knitted hats. Every single one of them came back. Item 13. Item 14. Item 15. The blue folder was getting heavy. The red return to sender stamps were starting to look like bloodstains on the white envelopes. Diane wasn't just ignoring me. She was erasing my children before they even had names. The real knife in the back didn't come from Diane, though. It came from Paige. While we were skipping meals to pay for server space, Paige was planning the event of the season back in Ohio. Tess, a girl I'd known since middle school, called me one night while I was hosing down baby bottles. Her voice was hesitant, the kind of tone people use when they're about to tell you someone died. She told me Paige was getting married. Over 200 guests, open bar, imported lilies, a 5-tier cake that cost more than my first car. How? I asked, looking at the gray slush of half-eaten beans in my bowl. They don't have that kind of money, Tess. They don't now, Tess whispered. Your dad emptied his entire 401k, Demi. He took out a second mortgage on the house. Diane told everyone it was worth it because Paige is the one who stayed and she deserves a proper family send-off. The air in the kitchen went thin. My father, the man who told me I'd have to figure it out on my own for a college deposit, had liquidated his entire retirement to buy Paige a party. He was working 60 hours a week at the shop with a busted knee just to pay for champagne he couldn't afford. It wasn't just a slap in the face, it was a declaration of war. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking so hard I nearly dropped the receiver. An hour later, Tess sent me a screenshot. It was from a group chat with all our old high school friends, the Millfield Circle. Paige had posted a photo of her wedding invitation, then followed it up with a message that made the blood in my veins turn to slush. It's sad, really, Paige had typed. The twins won't ever know what it's like to have real grandparents. No one is coming from our side. But that was Demi's choice when she decided to marry into that kind of world. Some people just don't value blood legacy. That kind of world. She didn't have to say the words. We all knew what she meant. She was talking about Marcus. She was talking about my children's skin. She was turning their existence into a punchline for her white-bread social circle. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my phone. I walked into the garage, the cold concrete floor biting through my socks. Marcus looked up from his code, his eyes bloodshot and weary. He saw my face and started to stand, but I just held up a hand. I didn't want comfort. I wanted a record. I sat at the desk and opened the laptop. I hit print. The inkjet printer groaned, the mechanical whirring sound cutting through the silence of the garage like a saw. The paper slid out, warm and smelling of ozone. I took the screenshot of Paige's message and walked over to the filing cabinet. I grabbed the heavy-duty metal hole punch. I lined up the edges of the paper. Clack, clack. The sound was violent. Final. 2 perfect round holes where Paige's name used to be. I opened the blue plastic folder. I slid the page into the 16th sleeve. My knuckles were white as I smoothed out the plastic. Item 16, I whispered to the empty garage. The twins were asleep in the next room, unaware that their own aunt had just signed their eviction notice from the family tree. I looked at Marcus, at the busted laptops, and at the canned beans on the workbench. I wasn't just building a company anymore. I was building a fortress. And when the walls were high enough, I was going to make sure the people of Millfield were on the outside, screaming to get in. I closed the drawer and turned off the light. The garage went black, except for the tiny, blinking green lights of the servers. The clock was ticking, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was the dark. Year 7. The grit never really leaves you, but the scenery sure as hell changes. The office in downtown Portland felt like a different planet compared to the garage where we'd spent 3 years breathing in exhaust fumes and hope. Here, the air was filtered, sterile, and cold. The floor-to-ceiling glass looked out over a city that finally knew our names. Compliance Corps was no longer a desperate crawl through the mud. It was a high-speed machine. We'd just closed our Series B, $68 million in fresh capital. The valuation on paper made my head spin, but my spine stayed military straight. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the leather smelling like a new car, and stared at a copy of Forbes sitting on my desk. The paper felt crisp, thick, and expensive. It made a dry, crinkling sound as I flipped to page 42. There I was, Demi Cook, CFO, the woman who turned logistics into gold. I wasn't wearing a thrift store lace dress anymore. I was wearing a $600 charcoal blazer with seams so sharp they could draw blood. Money is a strange thing in America. It heals the blind. It cures the deaf. In the Rust Belt towns like Millfield, it's the only god anyone actually worships. For 9 years, I had been a ghost to the people of Ohio. I was the daughter who'd run off with the wrong kind of man. I was the officer who didn't send enough cash home. I was a dead branch on the family tree. But as soon as those 6 zeros hit the local newswire, the resurrection began. The silence that had lasted nearly a decade shattered like cheap glass. It started with a call from Tess. Her voice sounded small, filtered through a bad connection and miles of resentment. She didn't ask how Marcus was doing. She didn't ask about Liam or Ava's first day of school. She didn't even ask if I was still in the Army Reserve. "Your mom called me this morning, Demi," Tess said. I could hear her lighting a cigarette, the sharp rasp of the lighter followed by a heavy exhale. She wanted to know if I knew what a Series B was. She spent 3 hours on Google looking up your company. She's telling everyone at the diner that she always knew you had a head for business, that you got it from her side of the family. A bitter, cold laugh escaped my throat. It sounded like gravel hitting a tin roof. Diane hadn't called me when I was deployed to the desert. She hadn't called when Liam had that 104-degree fever that nearly broke my heart. She hadn't asked if I'd survived the shrapnel or the sandstorms. But now she was a financial analyst. She was a scholar of venture capital. "She's proud of you," Tess added, though her voice lacked conviction. "She's proud of the math, Tess, not the daughter," I said. I hung up. I didn't have time for the nostalgia of parasites. 2 nights later, the real show started. Tess sent me a series of screenshots from the Cook family group chat. The blue bubbles on the screen were a map of greed. Paige was leading the charge, as usual. 68 million, Paige had typed. I could almost see her smirking at her phone, her eyes lit up with the reflection of a life she hadn't earned. "That means the IPO will be 300 million easy," Demi is the money now. We need to get a list together. A real list. New roof for mom. A college fund for my kids. A boat for dad. He's worked long enough. Diane's response followed a minute later. I'll handle her. I'm flying out to Portland. I'll present it as a family investment opportunity. She's an officer. She understands hierarchy. She'll do what's right for the bloodline. My father's name popped up next. A single, weak sentence that made my stomach turn. I don't know, Diane. This feels wrong. Diane shut him down instantly. She's richer than this whole damn town, Kenneth. She's got enough to help us 10 times over. It's her duty. She owes us for the years we put into her. I sat in my Jeep in the parking garage, the engine ticking as it cooled. The smell of hot rubber and city dust filled the cabin. I stared at the phone until the screen went dark. She. The money. The investment. Not Demi. Not a daughter. Not a mother. Just a vault they were planning to crack open. They weren't even hiding it. They were vultures circling a carcass they thought was already dead. My knuckles were white where they gripped the steering wheel. I felt a cold, familiar rage settling in my gut, the kind of rage that wins wars. I didn't reply to the chat. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a fight. I pulled out my laptop, the screen's blue light reflecting in the window of the Jeep. I hit print. The small portable printer in the back seat whirred to life. I watched the paper slide out, the text of their greed immortalized in black ink. I grabbed the blue plastic folder from the passenger seat. I didn't even hesitate. I slid the screenshots into the 26th sleeve. I took my red Sharpie and wrote Item 26 in bold, jagged letters. I didn't go home. I drove straight to a law firm in the Pearl District. The building was all steel and intimidation. I met with a man in a $3,000 suit who didn't blink when I told him what I wanted. I want an irrevocable trust, I told him. My voice was flat, military grade. Everything for the twins, Marcus and Cora as trustees. I want it locked down so tight that even if I die, not a single cent can be touched by anyone with the last name Cook. I want a wall around my children that no one in Ohio can climb. The lawyer nodded. He understood the language of protection. That can be done, Captain. I signed the papers. The pen felt heavy, like a weapon. Every stroke was a strike against Millfield. Every signature was a nail in the coffin of family duty. When I walked back out to my Jeep, the Portland rain had started again. A light mist that felt like a baptism. I felt light. I felt dangerous. I checked my phone one last time before pulling out into traffic. A new notification from Tess. A photo of a plane ticket. Diane was coming. She was landing in 48 hours. She thought she was coming for a payday. She had no idea she was flying straight into a minefield I'd been prepping for 9 years. I leaned back and looked at the blue folder. Item 26 was ready. And I was just getting started. Year 9. New York City in the summer feels like a humid lung. It is thick, heavy, and smells like hot garbage and expensive cologne. Times Square was a blinding jungle of neon and glass as Marcus and I stood on the balcony of the NASDAQ exchange. 9:30 hours. The air was electric with the hum of 1,000 servers and the frantic energy of traders. When we hit the button and the bell rang, it was not just a sound. It was a gunshot that shattered the old world. The IPO was a monster. A $440 million valuation. On paper, my net worth hit $44 million in a single heartbeat. The disowned daughter from the Rust Belt was now the master of a digital empire. The flashing lights of the cameras felt like tracers in the dark. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. The label of "The Girl Who Left" was bleached white by the glare of success. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A voicemail. Millfield area code. I stepped away from the champagne and the cheering developers to listen. It was Kenneth, my father. His voice was a thin, mumble-heavy wreck, filtered through the static of a cheap connection. Demi, I saw the news. I am proud of you. Your mother saw it too. She wants to talk. We should be a family again. The hypocrisy tasted like copper in my mouth. He was proud of the stock price, not the soldier. He was proud of the commas in my bank account, not the daughter who had scrubbed floors to survive. I did not delete the message. I just locked the screen. The predators were officially on the move. 48 hours later, I was back in my office in Portland. The high of New York had faded into the cold reality of the battlefield. On my desk sat a white envelope. It was the one I had sent 3 weeks ago for the twins' birthday. A collection of high-resolution photos of Liam and Ava. It was stamped with the same violent red ink I had grown to despise. Refused. Returned to sender. I picked it up, ready to slide it into the blue folder and move on. But my officer's eyes caught a detail that did not fit. The paper around the flap was mangled. The adhesive had been ripped away and then crudely repaired. Someone had opened this. I sat down and pulled the desk lamp closer. The light was a harsh, clinical white. I did not use a letter opener. I used my fingers to feel the texture of the repair. There it was. A strip of clear Scotch tape, wrapped haphazardly around the edge of the envelope. It was a sloppy amateur job. I took a deep breath and peeled the tape back. The sound was a high-pitched, screeching rip that echoed in the silent office. I pulled the photos out. On the corner of a picture of Ava, there was a dark, gray streak. I rubbed it with my thumb. I knew that smell. It was a mix of machine grease and pine shavings. It was the scent of my father's workshop. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Kenneth had opened the mail. He had stood in that dark kitchen or out in his shop, and he had looked at his grandchildren. He had seen Liam's crooked smile and Ava's bright, searching eyes. He had held their images in his grease-stained hands. And then Diane had walked in. I could see the scene in my head as clearly as a drone feed. I could hear her voice, cold and sharp as a razor. "Seal it back up, Kenneth. She is dead to us. We do not look at those children." And because he was a coward, he had grabbed a roll of cheap tape from the drawer. He had sealed the envelope back up, hiding the evidence of his own heart, and sent it back to the daughter he claimed to be proud of. He had chosen Diane's ego over the only blood legacy he actually had left. I felt a surge of rage so pure it made my vision blur. It was not just about the rejection anymore. It was about the theft. Diane had stolen the right of a grandfather to love his grandchildren, and she had turned my father into a silent accomplice. She was not just a mother with a grudge, she was a warden. I took the envelope and pasted it onto a fresh sheet of A4 paper. I grabbed my red Sharpie. My hand was as steady as a rock. I wrote Item 28 in block letters that felt like a declaration of war. The dossier was nearly full. Every lie, every returned letter, every act of cowardice was now documented and filed. I was no longer collecting memories. I was building a case. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt the stinging ice of a parent who chooses their own pride over your happiness, I want you to hit that like button right now. It is time we stop staying silent about the people who are supposed to protect us, but choose to break us instead. Do me a huge favor. Comment the word freedom below. I want to see a sea of freedom in the comments to show that we are no longer defined by the people who gave up on us. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You do not want to miss the next chapter because the battle is about to move to my front porch. 3 days later, Tess sent me a text message. Paige is in Portland. She is staying at a hotel downtown. She was seen outside your gated community this morning. She was taking photos of your Tesla and the security gate. My sister was no longer just a gossiping brat in Ohio. She was a scout for an invasion force. An hour later, a notification popped up on my personal phone. A text from Diane. I am landing at PDX tomorrow morning. I am coming to your house at 8 o'clock. It is time to heal this family, Demi. Do not be difficult. We have much to discuss regarding the future. I looked at the blue plastic folder sitting on my desk. I stroked the old scar on the back of my hand, feeling the phantom itch of the desert sand. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the door. I did not feel fear. I felt the cold, sharp focus of an officer who had just finished locking and loading. Let them come. Portland was my territory now, and I had 28 reasons to end this. 8 o'clock sharp. The red dot on the security monitor pulsed like a slow, steady heartbeat. Diane Cook didn't knock. She didn't ring the bell. She just stood there on my porch, waiting for the world to open up for her as if by divine right. Through the wide-angle lens of the camera, she looked older, sure. The lines around her mouth were deeper, etched by decades of frowning at people who didn't meet her standards. But that beige wool coat was still pressed to a crisp, and her hair was a helmet of spray-fixed blonde that wouldn't move in a Category 5 hurricane. I pulled the heavy oak door open. No hug? No. It's been 9 years, Demi. She didn't even look me in the eye. Her gaze swept past my shoulder, tracking the height of the vaulted ceiling, the crystal chandelier, the custom crown molding. She walked in like she was a municipal inspector here to appraise a foreclosed property. Her heels made a sharp, rhythmic click-clack on the wide plank oak floors, a sound that felt like nails being driven into the quiet of my Saturday morning. "Nice place," she muttered. "I see you've spent your money well. Or Marcus's money. It's hard to tell who's holding the purse strings in a house like this." I didn't answer. I led her into the kitchen. The air was cool and scrubbed clean by the heap of filters I kept running around the clock to keep the Portland pollen at bay. But Diane brought the smell of Ohio with her, a cloying, heavy cloud of cheap department store perfume and staleness that clung to her wool coat. She stopped by the refrigerator. Right there, pinned under a magnet, was a photo of Cora. She was covered in mud, laughing, holding Liam and Ava after they'd spent the afternoon digging for worms in the garden. It was the heart of my home. Diane's eyes drifted over the photo for less than a second. No pause. No. So these are my grandkids. Nothing. To her, those children were just obstacles in a math problem she was trying to solve. Instead, she reached out and ran a bony, pale finger along the edge of the Calicut marble island. She felt the cold stone, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the cost per square foot. She pulled out a leather-bound stool and sat down without being asked. "You've done well for yourself, Demi," she said. Her voice was flat, like a dead battery. "I suppose that's what happens when you turn your back on the people who raised you. You get to keep all the spoils for yourself." I didn't say a word. I just leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her. My heart was at 140 beats per minute. I felt the heat rising in my neck, but I forced it down. I used the 4-4-4 breathing I'd learned in the service. In, hold, out. I wasn't a daughter right now. I was a major. I was an officer watching an insurgent walk into a kill zone. She didn't wait for me to speak. She reached into her leather handbag, the one I'd bought her for Christmas 15 years ago, back when I still thought I could earn her love, and pulled out a piece of paper. It was folded into a tight, perfect square. She didn't hand it to me. She slid it across the marble. The sound of the paper on the stone was a long, dry rasp that made the hair on my arms stand up. I unfolded it. Handwritten. Blue ink. Diane's script was always sharp, the letters leaning forward as if they were trying to shove the reader off the page. I scanned the lines. $500,000 for the family retirement fund. $200,000 for Paige's kids' tuition. Kids I'd never even seen. $45,000 for my father's knee replacement. $180,000 to clear the mortgage on the Millfield house. And a maintenance stipend of $3,000 a month. Total, $925,000. "It's time we talk about the family's future, Demi," she said, leaning back and clasping her hands on the counter. "It's time you did what's right. Your father is hurting. Your sister is struggling. We put everything into you, and this is your chance to buy back your place in this family. This is how we make things whole again." Buy back? The word echoed in my head like a gunshot. I looked at the list. I thought about the 9 years of red stamps. I thought about the return-to-sender envelopes. I thought about Marcus scrubbing grease off his hands in a freezing garage while we ate canned beans because we were too proud to ask for a dime. I thought about my children not knowing their grandfather's voice because this woman decided they weren't the right class to be cooks. Diane sat there, smug, waiting for me to pull out the checkbook. She thought she had me. She thought my success made me soft. She thought the guilt of my bank account would be her ultimate leverage. She had no idea who she was talking to. I didn't scream. I didn't call the cops. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a single tear. I reached down and opened the bottom drawer of the built-in desk at the end of the island. The drawer slid out with a smooth, expensive whisper. I reached inside and pulled out the blue plastic folder. It felt heavy in my hands. Substantial. It wasn't just paper, it was a dossier. It was a history of every time she'd tried to bury me. I stood up and placed the folder on the marble right next to her invoice. The plastic cover caught the light from the pendant lamps, glowing like a piece of deep-sea ice. I didn't say a word as I rested my hand on top of it. "You brought a list, Mom," I said. My voice was low, steady, the kind of tone I used when I was giving coordinates for an extraction. "But I've been keeping a report for 9 years, and unlike yours, mine has receipts." Diane's eyes dropped to the blue folder. Her hands tightened on the marble. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, save for the hum of the refrigerator. The countdown was over. It was time to show her exactly what $925,000 worth of betrayal looked like. The navy blue plastic folder sat on the white calicotta marble like a heavy piece of shrapnel. It was thick, rigid, and carried the weight of a decade's worth of cold-blooded exclusion. Diane didn't move. Her gaze stayed locked on her own handwritten invoice, that $925,000 demand that she thought was her golden ticket. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the wine fridge and the frantic, shallow rhythm of Diane's breathing. A single bead of sweat broke from her hairline, carving a slow path through the thick layer of drugstore foundation on her forehead. "You want to talk about the family future, Diane?" I didn't call her Mom. That word had died in a barracks bunk years ago. I flipped the first page. The plastic sleeve crinkled, a sharp, biting sound in the silence. Item 01, 9 years ago. Your ultimatum. You told me if I married Marcus, I was dead to this family. You said he wasn't one of us. Do you remember the ink you used? It was the same blue pen you used for this bill. Diane's bottom lip gave a tiny, involuntary twitch. She didn't look at the paper. She looked at the marble. "I tried to build a bridge," I said, my voice as flat and clinical as a post-action report. I flipped to the next 3 pages. Item 02. Item 03. Item 04. These are the wedding photos you sent back. These are the Christmas cards you refused to open. Look at the stamps, Diane. Look at the red ink. I tapped the plastic with a blunt fingernail, the sound echoing like a soft hammer strike. You didn't just reject a wedding invite. You officially signed my death warrant as a daughter. You told me I didn't exist until you saw my name in Forbes. I was just trying to protect the house," Diane stammered. Her voice was thin, reedy, stripped of its usual Rust Belt authority. "I was angry. People say things when they're angry. But Paige always loved you." "Paige?" I felt a cold, jagged smile pull at the corner of my mouth. I flipped straight to the middle of the folder. Item 16. I watched Diane's eyes track the printed screenshot of the group chat. Item 16. Paige mocking my children. Paige telling the whole town that my kids don't have real grandparents because of my choices. While you were watching her post that, you were letting Dad drain his 401k to buy her a 5-tier cake and a boat he'll never use. You spent his retirement on a party for the good daughter while I was heating up canned beans in a freezing garage to keep my kids warm. Diane's hand moved on the counter, her fingers twitching toward her handbag like she was looking for a weapon. She pulled them back when she saw the look in my eyes. She looked like she wanted to vomit. The entitlement was evaporating, replaced by the raw, ugly realization that I had been counting every strike. "We're your parents, Demi," she hissed, her voice suddenly regaining its sharp edge. The fake tears started then, thick crocodile drops that smeared her eyeliner into gray streaks. "You're sitting on millions. You're living in a palace. You're going to let your father die with a busted knee because you're too proud to forgive a few letters. You're a monster. You're cold-blooded." "No," I said. "I'm an officer. And I've saved the best for last." I turned to the final page. Item 28. I watched the color drain from Diane's face until she looked like gray ash. The envelope was there, mangled and repaired with cheap Scotch tape. I could still smell the faint, ghostly scent of pine shavings and diesel grease clinging to the plastic. Dad opened this, I whispered. He saw his grandkids. He wanted to know them, and you made him tape it shut. You made him act like a coward and send it back just to protect your ego. You didn't just kill my relationship with you, Diane. You stole his right to be a grandfather. You turned my father into a silent accomplice in your own little war. Diane's eyes went wide. The gaslighting stopped. The family future talk was dead. She was staring at the tape, the physical evidence of her own cruelty. For a second, the silence in the kitchen was so heavy it felt like it would crack the marble. Then she snapped. "You little bitch!" Diane shrieked. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. She lunged across the island, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Her fingers, tipped with cheap acrylic nails, clawed at the air, reaching for the blue folder. She wanted to tear it. She wanted to shred the evidence of the last 9 years so she could go back to pretending she was the victim. "I gave you life. You owe me everything." She never reached the folder. A large, heavy hand dropped onto Diane's wrist, pinning it to the marble with the effortless strength of a man who spent his life moving engines. The smell of peppermint soap and industrial grease hit the air. Marcus was standing right behind me, his shoulders blocking out the light from the hallway. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just stood there like a wall of granite, his dark eyes fixed on Diane with a look of quiet, dangerous disgust. Diane froze. Her chest was heaving, her breath coming in jagged, ugly gasps. She looked at Marcus, the man she'd called not one of us. And for the first time in her life, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't greed. It was terror. I stood up slowly, my back straight, my gaze locked on the woman who had brought an invoice to a battlefield. I picked up the blue folder and tucked it under my arm. "The audit is over, Diane," I said. "And you're bankrupt." The silence in the kitchen did not just fall. It crushed. Marcus did not say a word, and he did not have to. He stood there in a faded charcoal flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms built by years of wrestling heavy machinery and lines of code. His old, scuffed sneakers were a direct insult to the polished marble floor, but he did not care. The man who owned half of a multi-million-dollar empire looked like he had just stepped off a shift at a garage in Millfield. With a single fluid motion, he swiped Diane's hand away from the blue folder, pinning her wrist to the stone with the casual strength of a man who knew exactly where the power sat in this room. He did not scream. He did not threaten. He simply stepped forward and placed both hands on my shoulders. The weight of them was like a pair of lead plates, solid, grounding, and absolute. It was a physical declaration of war against anyone who thought they could still hurt me. 9 years ago, I'd looked at my father, Kenneth, and seen a man who would rather swallow his own tongue than stand up to his wife's cruelty. He had stood in the shadows of our old hallway and watched his daughter get erased. But today, Marcus was the mountain. He was the anchor. He was the man who had been in the trenches with me when the only thing we had to eat was cold, canned beans, and the only thing we had to keep us warm was the heat coming off a laptop fan. Diane's chest was heaving, her breath coming in jagged, wet gasps that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. She tried to yank her hand back, but Marcus's grip was a vice. He looked down at her with a quiet, dangerous disgust that seemed to peel the layers of fake tan and arrogance right off her face. I stood up slowly. In my 4-inch heels and tailored blazer, I stood a full head taller than the woman who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. I looked at her, and for the first time in 30 years, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the cold, clinical detachment of a CFO looking at a bad debt that needed to be written off the books. "You said he was not on our level, Diane," I said. My voice was low, steady, and carried the sharp edge of a straight razor. "You told me he was a mistake. You said he was not one of us." I leaned in until I could see the fine, trembling lines of her smeared eyeliner. "You were right. He is not on your level. He is miles above it. While you were spending my father's 401k on a wedding for a sister who mocks my children, this man was working 20-hour days to build a fortress for us. His mother, Cora, is the only grandmother my kids will ever know. She did not need an IPO to find her way to Portland. She showed up when we were broke. Diane opened her mouth, her lips pale and dry. Demi, please. We are blood. You have so much. What is $1,000,000 to you? It is nothing. It is 925,000 reasons to say no, I replied. I picked up the handwritten invoice, the blue ink that looked like a stain on the white marble, and held it between two fingers. I am not giving you a single cent, not because I do not have it. I could write this check right now and not even feel the dent in my daily interest. But I will not do it because if I pay you, I am telling you that you were right. I flicked the paper back at her. It drifted through the air and landed near her handbag, useless and hollow. If I sign this, I am agreeing that my children's existence has a price tag, I said. I am agreeing that it is okay to discard your daughter for 9 years as long as she pays a late fee when she becomes successful. I am not your retirement plan, Diane, and I am certainly not a bank for Paige's incompetence. The mask did not just slip, it disintegrated. Diane's face twisted into a snarl of pure, unadulterated venom. She grabbed her bag, shoving the crumpled invoice inside with trembling hands. You ungrateful brat, she shrieked, her voice cracking against the high ceilings. I hope you rot in this house. I hope your kids grow up to hate you just as much as you hate me. You will be alone, Demi. Just you and your money. Marcus let go of her wrist. He did not say a word, but he stepped to the side, clearing a path to the door. His eyes were cold, flat, and completely unimpressed. Diane did not look at him. She could not. She scurried past him, the sharp click-clack of her heels sounding frantic and weak as she retreated across the oak floors. I watched her through the kitchen window. She did not look back. She climbed into her rental car, her hands shaking so hard she almost dropped her keys. Marcus followed her out, not to say goodbye, but to ensure the perimeter was clear. I stood there in the silent kitchen, the smell of her cheap perfume already fading into the filtered air. Marcus came back inside a minute later. He walked to the front door and gripped the heavy brass handle. He looked at me for a heartbeat, his expression softening into something quiet and sure. Then he pulled the door shut. Thud. The sound of the heavy oak meeting the frame was solid and final. Then came the mechanical whir-click of the electronic deadbolt sliding into place. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a border being closed. It was the sound of a life finally becoming my own. Marcus walked back into the kitchen and picked up the blue folder. He did not open it. He just tucked it under his arm and reached out for my hand. His palm was warm, rough with calluses, and smelled faintly of the engine oil from the old Jeep he refused to trade in. She's gone, Demi, he said. I nodded, leaning my head against his shoulder. The war was over, the audit was finished, and for the first time in 9 years, the house was finally quiet. 2 weeks had passed since the electronic lock had clicked shut behind Diane Cook. The house in Portland had finally begun to breathe again. The cloying, heavy scent of her department store perfume had been scrubbed from the air, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of cedar rain and the faint aroma of the dark roast coffee Marcus brewed every morning at 5 a.m. The silence was no longer a weapon used to isolate me. It was a sanctuary. I sat in my home office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the gray Oregon mist rolling over the Douglas firs. The war was over, but the air still felt like the aftermath of a storm. Charged, quiet, and thick with the weight of things left unsaid. The vibration of my phone on the mahogany desk sounded like a swarm of bees. I did not recognize the number at first, but the area code was 740. Millfield, Ohio. My chest tightened, a familiar reflex from a decade of conditioning. I picked it up on the third ring. I did not say hello. I just waited. Demi? The voice on the other end was a wreck. It was Kenneth, my father. He sounded like a man who had spent the last 14 days staring at a wall. There was a rasp in his throat, a tremor that spoke of age and a lifetime of swallowing his own pride. I am not calling for the money, Demi. I do not want the check. I do not want the retirement fund. I saw the photos before she made me send them back. I saw their eyes. They look like you when you were a girl. I just want to know my grandkids. I want to see their faces without a stamp on them. A sharp, hot pain flared in the center of my chest. It was the sound of a man speaking from the rubble of his own cowardice. He had waited until the dictator had been defeated to sue for peace. He had waited until I had built a $44 million wall to ask for a seat at the table. I closed my eyes, the image of that scotch-taped envelope flashing in my mind like a crime scene photo. I could have hung up. I could have told him that he had lost that right the second he picked up the tape. But I was not a monster. I was an officer, and I knew how to negotiate a treaty. "Here are the terms, Kenneth," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the warmth a daughter should have, but holding the steady authority of a commander. A video call. Once every 2 weeks. 20 minutes. You will not mention Diane. You will not mention Paige. You will not mention a single dollar or a single debt. If you bring her into the frame, if you even whisper her name to my children, the line goes dead forever. This is a demilitarized zone. Do you understand? I heard him break. It was not a dignified cry. It was the ragged, ugly sob of a man who realized he had spent his life protecting the wrong person. "I understand," he choked out. "Thank you, Demi. Thank you." I ended the call before I could feel sorry for him. Compassion was a luxury I could not yet afford. Seconds later, a text message bubbled up from a different number. "Paige, the good daughter, back in Ohio." "I hope you are happy," the message read. "You had the chance to change everything for this family. You could have saved us. You are cold-blooded, Demi. You always were. You think that money makes you better than us, but you are just as broken as the rest of." I did not finish reading it. I did not feel the sting of her words anymore. I simply pressed down on her contact and hit block. The mosquito had been swatted. The noise was gone. I turned my attention back to the desk. The navy blue plastic folder was still there. 29 items. 29 pieces of evidence that I had used to purchase my freedom. I ran my hand over the rigid texture of the cover. This book was not a collection of hate. It was the tactical map of my survival. It was the reason I could stand straight when the world told me to kneel. It was the shield that had kept my spirit alive in that freezing garage while we heated up canned beans over a hot plate. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk. It was deep and dark, lined with black velvet. I reached into a box of office supplies and pulled out 3 small white packets of silica gel. I tossed them into the folder to keep the moisture of the Pacific Northwest from yellowing the pages. I did not want the ink to fade. I wanted these receipts to remain as sharp as the day they were written, even if they were never read again. I placed the folder at the very back of the drawer. I pushed it into the shadows until it was out of sight. Thud. The drawer closed with a heavy, satisfying sound of finality. There would be no item 30. The audit was closed. The ledger was balanced. I walked over to the window and looked down into the backyard. The sun was finally breaking through the clouds, lighting up the emerald green of the lawn. Marcus was out there, his large frame hunched over as he pushed the twin wooden swings. I could hear the high, bell-like laughter of Liam and Ava as they flew into the air, their small boots kicking toward the sky. They did not know about the blue folder. They did not know about the $925,000 invoice. They only knew that the air was safe. Cora stepped out onto the back porch, her gray hair tied back in a practical bun. She was carrying a wooden tray with thick slices of toasted sourdough and small bowls of fruit. She looked up at my window and gave a small, knowing nod. She did not share my blood. She had never seen the inside of the house in Millfield. But she had been the one who held my hand when the world felt like a freezing garage. I watched them for a long time, the chosen family I had fought for. I realized then that the old definition of family was a lie. Family was not the people who happened to share your last name. Family was not the people who expected a payout for the bare minimum of your existence. Family was the team that held the line with you when the supplies ran low and the enemy was at the gate. It was the people who stayed in the trench when the lights went out. I turned away from the window and walked toward the door. I did not look back at the desk. I did not look back at the drawer. I walked out of the office and headed down the stairs to join the people who actually loved me. Behind me, the house was silent, but it was no longer empty. The war was over. I was finally home.